that Minnesota's economy is improving. The projected forecast for real GDP growth for calendar 2011 has been increased in just 3 months from projected 2.3% to 3.2%. That's a 39% increase in the projected rate of growth. The bad news is there are still over 200,000 Minnesotans unemployed. As I learned again today from our national experts, the employment recovery is slow in both Minnesota and across the country. In particular, both President Obama and Secretary of Treasury Geithner referred to the lagging construction industry, in both commercial construction and housing construction, as a principal reason for the lagging economic recovery in the country and employment growth, which goes back again to the imperative that we have a bonding bill in Minnesota that makes investments in improving our infrastructure and putting people back to work in the private sector construction industry. The projected deficit is now improved to 15% of projected state revenues for the next biennium. That's down from 19% previously, which placed us as the 5th worst state in the nation in deficit projected as a percent of revenues. And while it's improved, it's still a matter for serious concern and underscores the imperative that the legislature and I reach agreement by May 23rd on our constitutional responsibility to balance the state budget for the next biennium. I give the credit for this improvement first to President Obama's economic recovery. As I said, it's clear from the reports we received and from the evidence that the national economic recovery is underway. Secretary Geithner said today, using the analogy of a basketball game, we're in the second quarter of the national economic recovery. The increase in real GDP, as I indicated, is one that is based or is improved over a projection made just 3 months ago. So it's a very remarkable increase of 39% in the projected rate of growth from the 2.3% to 3.2%. And I think it's significant that the consulting firm now places a 20% probability on the most optimistic scenario for the future compared to a 15% probability of the most pessimistic. Secondly, I'd say this improvement shows, again, at the macroeconomic level, the triumph of Keynesian economics. The legislation passed by the Congress, bipartisan legislation, and with President Obama's leadership, resulted in a 2% reduction in the payroll tax. That is a tax reduction that goes primarily to the benefit of middle-income families. Economists would say that both the employer and the employee side of the payroll tax is essentially a tax reduction for working individuals. And the extension of the unemployment benefits for calendar 2011 is money that Dr. Stinson pointed out when he briefed me last week on the general economic situation as a direct stimulative effect because that money goes in the pockets of unemployed Minnesotans and they turn around and spend that money. And I would point out that that is government spending, that extending unemployment benefits for a year is at the federal level government spending that translates directly into enhancing the economic recovery. And I believe that Dr. Stinson, I'm told, made that point this morning as well, that government spending has a more immediate and direct benefit on increased consumer consumption and therefore retail sales, et cetera, than does a tax cut at the very top level. And the elimination of the incentives for capital gains, the elimination of the uncertainty for capital gains stabilized both those individuals' behavior for the future as well as the financial markets. And third, Minnesota's Health and Human Services spending is projected to be $165 million lower than originally assumed for this biennium and another $8 million for the next biennium. I think what's also important to recognize from this document here, the Minnesota Management Budget Highlights, which I believe was a copy which was provided to all of you just now, is if you look at the the 2 pages at the end of it, the document, following page 10. In terms of the question about the increase in projected expenditures for the next biennium compared to this biennium, if you look at those 2 pages, comparing this biennium with the next biennium, you'll see that for K-12 education, there's an increase of $4.19 billion. That's a result of the shift of minus about $1.8 billion in the current biennium compared to an increase of $1.3 billion for the next biennium. So you have a double, essentially it's a double count. And it's an increase in spending resulting from about 14,500 more school children expected in our public schools from kindergarten through 12th grade for the next biennium compared to this biennium. If you go to the category that says Health and Human Services, the increase from this biennium to the next biennium is about $3.76 billion. And as President Obama said today, the federal money, the FMAP, and other federal assistance in this year helped states, whether they thanked him for it or not. It reduced the necessary state expenditures for this biennium, but with that money stopping, the state, just to continue same level of services, has to increase by, again, $3.76 billion to the next biennium. So if you take those 2 categories alone, and of course K-12 education and health and human services combined are about 70% of our budget, 40% K-12 and 30% health and human services. Now it's up to 32%. I'm sorry, now it was 40 and 30 before, now it's 38 and 32, so it's still the same 70%, but 2% more on the health and human services category for the next biennium. That's almost $8 billion in those 2 categories alone. Increased state expenditures projected is based on the increased number of children, increased number of seniors expected to need home health care and other services, people with disabilities. About 80%, generalizing, of the health and human service expenditures go to the children, to the elderly, and to those with disabilities. So it underscores what's driving these increases is not somebody's discretionary interest in increasing spending, but rather what's required under current law. The state per pupil aid formula isn't being changed. It's just about a $500 million increase because of an increased number of students and these other factors. So that's the challenge that we continue to face, but I think it gives you a much clearer explanation for why we're in this situation than some of the others that are provided by people with other intents. So my response to this reduction of $1.16 billion in the deficit is to propose as a revision to my budget, so everything I'm describing now and the figures are compared to what the budget that I submitted on February 15th. First, I would propose to eliminate the 3% surcharge on incomes above $500,000. That was always intended to be temporary. I'm delighted that this revenue picture permits it to be extremely temporary and would reduce then the top rate that I'm proposing to the 10.95% in the so-called 4th tier, and it reinstates the pledge I made that Minnesota's top rate, as I propose it, would not be the highest in the nation. I also adopted former House Tax Chair Representative Ann Linczewski's excellent suggestion to increase the research and development tax credit for the first $2 million of R&D from 10% to 15%. That she thinks is one of the most effective ways we can really target tax relief and tax incentives to businesses that are making increasing their research and development, which again, as I've learned over this weekend, virtually all the experts agree is going to be absolutely crucial to restoring our competitiveness in the world economy. It involves the restoration of cuts for home and community-based services for our elderly, particularly important to enable them to stay in their homes. It reduces the cost of long-term care overall because if they're able to stay in their homes, their communities, which most would prefer, it's a much lower cost than nursing home care and other long-term care. I also do restore the all but 1% of the funding reduction for nursing homes. Restores the current eligibility for MinCare for both families and for childless adults. It restores $17 million of the $22 million that was cut for the community services grants, child and community services grants to counties. It restores the funding for the community action agencies, restores funding for Metro Transit and a comparable amount for regional transit so that there will be no state-imposed fee increases for bus fare and other public transit. Restores the money for the fire safety training, and it restores funding that was slated otherwise to be eliminated for the Minnesota Investment Fund. It's actually an incentive fund that I established when I was commissioner of the then Department of Energy and Economic Development back in the 1980s, and I take particular note that the two most recent announcements of expansions, AGCO in Jackson and BioVest here in the Capitol just last week, both the executives indicated the importance of that Minnesota Investment Fund financing as part of the package that induced them to expand the jobs here in Minnesota. I also wrote a letter today, I believe copies were distributed earlier, worth citing though to the legislative leadership, that because of the improved cash flow situation, the state for the balance of this year and expected into next year, I've urged the legislatures to repeal the delay in the business refunds for capital expenditures. This was a somewhat desperate and also counterproductive emergency cash flow management device of the previous administration, but it provides an important incentive for business investment and job creation. That refund not only provides that incentive to make those investments in purchasing new capital equipment here in Minnesota, but the immediacy of the refund provides cash to those businesses to continue their expansion, which results in additional job creation. So it was really, in its present form, cutting against the desire, undermining the desire of the credit itself to encourage business investment in Minnesota and the job creation that results from that. And I want to emphasize, again, the importance of the bonding bill to provide for job growth throughout Minnesota. As I said earlier, both the President and the Secretary of Treasury today cited the lagging construction industry, commercial construction, and housing as a key reason why the employment growth in our country has not been as what would be hoped. So that bonding bill, $1 billion that I'm proposing, should generate up to 28,000 new jobs in the private sector construction industry, is, in my view, vital to putting people back to work throughout Minnesota, particularly in the building trades where unemployment is very unacceptably high throughout our state. And it also underscores the value, if it's properly structured financially, of a people's stadium, which again, with the proper financial design, would require no expenditure from the general fund, and the project itself would put several thousand Minnesotans back to work in the construction industry over the next few years. Be glad to respond to questions.
With you removing the 3% fifth-year tax, is your tax proposal now in your proposed budget, is that still what you would call a progressive income tax system?
Well, it makes our regressive state and local tax system less regressive. Even with the 3% surcharge, our approximate calculations was that it would not restore us to even a flat tax, so-called, where people at the top income would pay the same percent of their income in state and local taxes as everyone else. But with the fourth tier, that is certainly a key factor, as well as the increase in the property tax for those value of homes over $1 million, as well as closing the snowbird loophole. It's a matter of basic tax fairness, as well as increased revenues. All of those will have the effect of lessening the regressivity of our state and local tax system.
The only one thing here to pay down the reserves or add more money to reserves, is that because reserves don't have constituents?
It's because we're waiting for some further refinements of the calculations based on these new numbers, and I'm cautiously optimistic that there will be some additional revenues that will be identified when revenue runs those calculations. Probably take about a week, and so I do intend to address that at that time.
One other
It's certainly important that we avoid borrowing for cash management, and very important that we not have to repeat what I'm asking the legislature to repeal, which is as a cash management device, a measure which I just described as being contrary to what we want to do to encourage economic growth and job creation.
How did you decide on these revisions? Was it things that were the most onerous to you, or items you've received pushback or feedback from organizations?
It was a combination. I was under great time pressure to take office and submit a budget by February 15th. It's illogical to me that any governor would be required to submit a budget on February 15th and then 2 weeks later have a revised budget forecast. But I didn't create the law, and I intended to follow it. So, I made my best judgment at that time based on that revenue forecast. Obviously, if I'd had these numbers, I never would have had to propose a surcharge. But under the circumstances then, I said at the time that was always intended to be temporary. It wasn't something I wanted to do. So I'm very pleased that these numbers permit that was the first priority. And then I did receive quite a bit of comment from those, particularly those who operate nursing homes and the home health care, that those cuts in particular were onerous. A number of the legislators who had been the architects of MinCare expressed their concerns about that effect. When I saw some of the published reports on the effect of the cuts on bus service and the likely fee increase resulting from it, that concerned me, because we want to encourage public transit as a way of reducing congestion on our highways. So it was, the combination of factors of what I heard from people in response to my initial budget and my own concerns.
What's the amount that's left in terms of cuts in the revised budget?
What is the gross?
The gross was around 965, so
Another about 765, 765 million. I mean, I just point out again, my approximate calculation is on the plane back today. Is if you take the increase in the permanent increase in the taxes proposal for most of which is the fourth tier, and then the ones I just cited, property tax, there's about 2.4 billion out of the $5 billion now in the deficit. So it's the tax side of it is just a little less than half, and the other combination of the surcharge fee increases, some of which is again returned back to the healthcare providers with these complicated formulas of federal reimbursements, like the shift. And then the net $770 million or so in spending reductions is just slightly more than the other half of the total equation. Sorry?
Why weren't cuts to higher education?
Well, I heard from both. I wouldn't like to make any cuts to higher education, and I wouldn't like to make some of the other cuts that are necessary. I did, in response, hear from President Brunix and Chancellor McCormick that while they certainly weren't happy with the proposed 5.9% reductions that I had made, that they could live with those proposed funding levels, and that they would not result in tuition increases any higher than the rate of inflation, which is still quite low. So the question, is say in the balance of where did the cuts seem to have the most severe effects, it seemed to be on the nursing homes and the home health care. But I'm very concerned, and 49, well, they weren't all there, but I would think you could probably safely say 49 other governors are very concerned about what's the driving costs of health care expenditures. And the shift, as I said, in our proportion of the budget for this for next biennium compared to this biennium, the education part of it, actually higher education stays about the same percentage, about 8%, but the K-12 education goes down by 2%, and about 2.1%, and the health and human services category goes up by 2.3%. So again, these and that's after the reductions that I proposed. So this increase, and it goes back again to the fact that the federal money, which was so important to enable Governor Pawlenty in the previous legislature to reduce the deficit, eliminate it for this biennium, is not going to carry forward. The President made that clear. It's obvious given the federal financial situation. So the burden has fallen back on the states now to pick up what the federal government was assisting with. I think it was what, $2.3 billion, Commissioner, the current biennium's combined total federal money. It's non-recurring.
Governor, can you say a few words about the compromise and all?
Well, the essence of compromise is that neither side gets totally what it wants, and each side has to accept some features that it might not consider ideal. I defer to the leadership of Commissioner Casilius, who, along with Michelle Kelm-Helgen on my staff and her staff, spent a tremendous amount of time, and I appreciate very much the legislative leadership's willingness to, and the committee chair's willingness to engage in ongoing negotiations. I think this is a textbook example for what needs to happen on these issues throughout the rest of this legislative session. I mean, many hours back and forth, input from other groups, other stakeholders, and the like. So, I mean, we reached a point where, the legislators informed me last Friday in a letter that they'd gone as far as they felt they could go, and I, wasn't, again, with Commissioner Casilius's considerations, totally happy with it. I think the lack of oversight from a higher education institution concerned Dr. Casilius about the assurance of quality for every child that walks into a Minnesota classroom deserves to have the best possible well-trained teacher. And yet we felt there was a reasonable alternative there with the Board of Teaching, and I, with the appointments I can make to the Board of Teaching, would strengthen its oversight capabilities. And so again, that's the essence of compromise. And so I did indicate that I would sign the legislation if it's passed in the form in which it was presented last Friday in writing.
However, the Education Minnesota Teachers Union does not like the compromise. You consider that a significant amount of opposition? They're clearly going to lobby lawmakers to change their minds on it. And what do you think of their opposition?
Well, it'd be great if everybody could agree to it, but that was I understood that about a week before the conclusion of it, that they were not going to support the agreement that we'd reached tentatively at that point. So I'm not surprised by it, but. I think that I understand the concerns that they have for representing their members. We have had thousands of really good teachers, and most of them young teachers, who have been laid off with the cutbacks in teaching positions throughout Minnesota. And so there are just, as I say, thousands of their members who want to teach, who've gone through the teaching preparation through college and postgraduate, who are very well qualified. I've listened to scores of them myself. They're 3 to 5 years of experience. They're right really at the peak of their maturity as teachers, and have all that energy and idealism and enthusiasm. And it's tragic that they're not able to find a teaching position to fulfill their career. So I understand the concern of Education Minnesota to want to assure those their members who are well qualified and have gotten high ratings and want to be in the classroom, who are being now denied the opportunity to do so. I understand that's what's driving their concerns.
The House voted today to send you HF1, the environmental permitting bill. Your commissioners and MPCA expressed some concerns with that bill. Are you ready to sign that, or do you still have some?
I've been gone for 4 days, and I have to get brought up to speed tomorrow with both the commissioners who are involved. There's a legislative auditors report coming out tomorrow, which I want to have a chance to review, and I've got a meeting tomorrow with some of the environmental groups who are expressing concerns. So this is one case where I will take probably all 3 days that are allowed to me to review that before I make up my mind. I'm open-minded about it either way, but I want to look at it very closely.
Governor, do you expect you're going to have to market this budget proposal now? I mean, obviously this is going to be a little bit of a PR war between you and Republicans who are saying now's not the time to raise taxes. Do you expect you're going to have to be on the road marketing this budget to the general public?
Well, again, ideally, I wouldn't raise taxes. Ideally, I'd like to make tax system in Minnesota, state and local, less regressive. So if you gave me a chance to keep it revenue neutral, I'd rebalance it. And I point out the legislature in its first action, the bill that I vetoed, would have raised property taxes by $428 million, according to the Minnesota Department of Revenue. And the property tax is the most regressive and the most unfair of the taxes, and it's the most onerous on businesses as well as individuals. So, I think we need to have an informed discussion in Minnesota about what's tax fairness and how unfair it's become over the last 15 years or so. But the reality about the revenue increase is, unlike the federal government, where they can run $1 trillion deficit, the states all have to balance their budgets, and so that means for every dollar of revenue you don't raise, you have to cut $1 of spending. And now it's imperative that the legislature assume its responsibility, and they're beginning to do so. I respect their process. I want them to take the time, in fact, over the next couple months, to consider very, very carefully what they're looking at doing, and to especially get input from Minnesotans who will be affected by their decisions, so that we can have an orderly and informed process here in Minnesota, in contrast, say, to Wisconsin, one where those decision makers are going to realize, as I say, that each one of those decisions has effects on a lot of Minnesotans' lives. So I encourage them to take the time to do so, and then after they've finished their budget process and produced a budget, passed a budget, then I think we'll have a more, comprehensive view on, and the public will have a better understanding of the trade-offs. If my budget is just standalone, as I said before, I wouldn't support my budget either if I didn't have to. It's not an ideal budget. There's no ideal way, or even a good way, to resolve what's now a $5 billion budget deficit. It's still 15% of projected revenues. It's still one of the highest on a percent basis of any of the states in the nation. And so I don't welcome having to do that, and I respect that they don't either. But you really can't analyze my budget or really assess it until you can compare it to something else that has to be as equally comprehensive and by Constitution as a complete resolution to the situation we all face. So it's hard to have a discussion about it or even debate some of the trade-offs involved when you don't know what the trade-offs are. But after they've completed their process, then we'll see it. For every dollar that they don't want to raise in revenues, and then they're going to have to cut a dollar in spending. And I will continue to insist that they acknowledge the linkage between local government aids and school aids, not only for the essential services, police and fire and quality of classroom, et cetera, class sizes, but also the impact on property taxes. And I have not yet heard the recognition or the willingness to acknowledge what the Minnesota Department of Revenue says is a clear correlation between cutting a dollar of local government aid and a 67-cent increase in property taxes. And this is not hypothetical in Minnesota when you consider property taxes are going from $4 billion to $7 billion in the last 8 years under the guise of no new taxes. And it's too convenient, too easy here to make cuts in what's called spending cuts, and shows up on the state ledger as a spending cut, whether for aid to cities or counties or townships or schools, and then the result of that is a property tax increase. But those dollars have to come out of people's pockets for property taxes every bit as much as they do for income tax or sales tax, and in fact, as I said earlier, they're more aggressive and more unfair. And people know that. And that's why you heard from cities and local officials and county officials and some chamber members, as well as the school authorities, who are all saying, we know that there's this direct connection. It's inescapable. Local governments are political subdivisions of the state. They're creations of the state. And their taxing authority is devised by the state. And they're restricted in what they can tax. We don't have, with a few exceptions, local sales taxes. We don't have a local income tax. So they got two options. They can either get the money from the state in terms of revenues, or they can raise money from the property tax. And if they don't get one or the other, then they have to cut services that people depend upon. And they've done that. So there's no easy here.
No, there's nothing that you're saying here really begs another question. The Republicans don't want to spend anymore. You want more progressivity. Is the way out of this impasse agreeing no more spending as long as the tax system is adjusted so that it's more progressive the way you want?
You're asking me to formulate the conclusion of this, and I'm not there yet. The process is very important to the outcome. So, again, we'll go through the process. But I was trying to make the point earlier with the almost $8 billion between the education, K-12, and the Health and Human Services, that this is money that is for the same level of services, education and health care, relative to the number of people. And the numbers I recall from population from this biennium to the next one is about 123,000 more people living in Minnesota and 14,500 more school children. And that's healthy growth. We want our population to grow. We would have lost a congressional seat if it hadn't. We wouldn't have the people for the jobs that we're hopefully going to create to grow our economy, which is the resolution we're all looking for, because more people working, more people paying taxes at the same rates or lower rates generates the income, the revenues that we all want in order to balance a budget and have healthy growth. But they also require basic services, and they use our highways. and they require, parks and recreation, the amenities that we provide. So all this is interrelated. I mean, one thing I learned again from the experts over this weekend is, low taxes is a consideration, but it is not the answer. It's not the answer among the states. It's not the answer among the countries. Or we wouldn't have jobs in Minnesota. We wouldn't have jobs in this country. It's a combination of factors, and it's infrastructure. And time after again, was referenced the fact that Republican President Dwight Eisenhower sponsored and led the construction of the interstate highway system. And most of the basic infrastructure that we have lived off of successfully in this society for the last half century, which is wearing out. And you go to China, you go to other countries where they're making those infrastructure improvements, those investments. And it's communications infrastructure, it's broadband, it's the infrastructure that moves electricity from one part of the country to another, so you don't have to build a nuclear power plant right on site. You can buy the electricity from somewhere else on the grid. I mean, these are all the kind of improvements that we need to keep investing in as a country if we're going to enjoy the standard of living that we require. And the point was made again and again to us, even in the context of cutting spending, which almost every governor is being required to do, don't crowd out the things that matter. Higher education. Don't stop your improvements in the quality of your higher education, your investment. I mean, the bonding bill is the University of Minnesota's scientific improvements is crucial to keeping the university a premier research university, to turn out graduates. They're talking about a shortage of engineers and scientists. I mean, to educate our young people for the jobs that are going to be available for the future, that are the growth opportunities, that with creating the entrepreneurs who are going to start the businesses that are going to be successful in this global economy. If we stop doing what we need to do to prepare for the future, then we're going to suffer the consequences. It's not just about deficit reduction. It's part of it. Yes, we have to reduce spending, we have to eliminate the deficit, and we also at the same time have to make these investments that are crucial for now, and they're crucial for the next generations to come.
Governor, so much of this projected revenue increase is based on capital gains, 39%, I believe. Even in the Stinson says that this is even more volatile than usual, this projection. And I understand we won't see that revenue until May of 2012. How confident are you that that revenue increase will be?
Well, when I looked at this, especially as I say in 3 months, assumptions, and it's not just that, it's the GDP. I thought to myself, sort of paraphrasing Everett Dirksen, a decimal here, a decimal there, pretty soon you're talking real money. His line was $1 billion here, $1 billion there, pretty soon you're talking real money. I mean, it's just a difference in a decimal point in an assumption for GDP growth or, capital gains behavior and the like causes these huge swings. And so it's inherently uncertain when you're talking about a 24-month period that doesn't begin until July 1st. And, what's happened with energy prices now just recently. And, again, the comforting part of what we heard over the weekend was that our economy could absorb the kind of price increases that exist today. Is not comfortably, but it's not going to destroy the economic growth. But if something even more catastrophic were to happen with our supply situation or the prices resulting from that, in this world, there's a certainty that the uncertain, the unforeseeable, the unpredictable are going to have major effects on both ways. But I think, the general sense I got from the experts, those, not political people, but experts, Bernanke and others, was they're reasonably confident that we're on a trajectory for recovery. Job recovery is lagging the rest of the economy. Business manufacturing increase last year was the highest in the last 15 years nationwide. So there's some, exports were up 20%, and so was up 19%. So agriculture, huge demand now. I met with Secretary Vilsack. He spoke to us. Agriculture exports and expected to increase there, and not only in China but countries like Vietnam and Singapore and the Republic of Korea, with the rising demand of their populations for meat consumption, soybean production, corn production, sales. And of course, then you got floods. So everything is maybe this, maybe that. But overall, I'd say that even the experts themselves, and in fact, the board of advisors, the report indicates, is more optimistic for the following year than the consulting firm. So if you ask me to weight on the scale of optimism, pessimism, I'd say I'm more optimistic than pessimistic about a continued growth, while recognizing that we have a lot of catching up to do.
Governor, if I may ask a question about what's happening in Madison with labor demonstrations. You've got Wisconsin and Indiana state senators hiding out in Illinois because there's a Democratic governor there. If they came to Minnesota, would you offer them refuge? What might you do? And has the topic of this and what's going on in labor demonstrations elsewhere in the Midwest, has this come up between you and other governors?
I mean, just very incidentally, Governor Walker was scheduled to chair the Health and Human Services Committee that I'm on yesterday, and he was not able to attend. NGA meetings, I remember staffing Governor Perpich at probably 6 or 7 of them during my time. I mean, the tradition is it's not partisan, it's not directly political, and especially if somebody's not there. I mean, it's not it was a little bit of an undercurrent of conversation, but. I mean, it's a free country. Anybody from Wisconsin come to Minnesota, helps our tourism industry. That anyone's within the rights to come here and freely and the like. And I don't wish the ill on Wisconsin, but I think it's a warning sign for the deliberations here how important it is that we keep it peaceful and responsible here, and also that the legislative process be deliberative. So that people believe and, in fact, are going to have a chance to be heard, to be listened to. I mean, a little disappointed. I wasn't there. Reports of a couple of the hearings last week, one on the bonding, where people are making some very impassioned statements about the importance of this, and some people are yawning or doodling or texting. These are important decisions, very important decisions. They all affect people's lives. That's why we're here. Make life better for the people of Minnesota. And so I think it's imperative, Wisconsin shows what happens on the other side of the coin, it's imperative that we have this deliberative, careful, respectful process and recognize that we're making decisions that are going to affect Minnesotans for the next 2 years and for years thereafter.
Governor, the line of provisions regarding D refers to Minnesota Investment Fund and other business incentives. What are some of the other business incentives, and do any of them relate to the Job Seed program that was created during the funding administration?
No, we're going to proposing to honor the current commitments under Job Z, but at least not at this point, not expand it. We'll continue the funding necessary to continue to honor the commitments that have been made to businesses that are relied on that for their decisions. It's $3 million to the Minnesota Investment Fund, which was I didn't realize at the time was scheduled to, the funding was not continued for this biennium, so it continues at the same level. And then $2 million for a redevelopment fund that Commissioner Phillips thinks is important. It's a way in which the D can work with local governments and collaborate on infrastructure improvement projects. What came to my mind was this stoplight in Thief River Falls that I'm going to go up and dig the hole for myself. If it gets enacted, where you've got almost 4,000 people going to and from work every day, and there's not a stoplight, and both Digi-Key and Articat believe strongly, and MnDOT says it's not in the plan until 2013 or beyond, and that's the kind of just common sense improvement where you make a relatively small investment, and you get a huge return in terms of the companies, the goodwill, and the opportunity for further job growth. So it's those two purposes: redevelopment fund, $2 million; Minnesota Investment Fund, $3 million.
Time for one last question.
Governor, you mentioned the fact that the economic report was a little bit more pessimistic than Dr. Stinson might believe. Do you think it's possible to maybe load the cuts in the second year of the biennium when you may actually have more revenue in the system?
Well, we're working on the biennium, but I clarify. I meant to say that I understand. You can clarify, Commissioner. It's the board of the in-house board of economic advisors that advises Dr. Stinson. And when I read the report, I read it not him himself, but that group of Minnesotans who advise and interact with the econometric firm. I mean, this is a 2-year process that we're engaged in now, but there's another legislative session next year. We'll have be informed by a November next year forecast, and we'll have a February forecast or March forecast of the following year, 2012, and we'll have the benefit at that point of first 6 and then about 8 months of the actual performance during that then current biennium. So. I think it's better to reserve judgment on anything that goes in, especially into the second year of the biennium, that deviates from what is being proposed here, to wait and see how reality sets in. Geithner quoted? He said Mike Tyson. No, he quoted Warren Buffett as saying that Mike Tyson spoke, or Buffett, somewhere he was there, and Mike Tyson said, he said every fight I had, my opponent came in with a plan, and then I hit him. So we'll take a few knocks before we go into next year. Thanks very much.
So the total budget,